Good evening, everyone. Hi, boy, I think I'm loud enough. Thank you for coming out in the cold weather this evening. We have a wonderful program tonight, and I want to welcome you to the Cathedral. My name's Randy Hollerith, and I'm the Dean of Washington National Cathedral, and on behalf of Mary Ann Buddy, the Bishop of the Diocese of Washington, and all of us who are blessed enough to serve this cathedral, we're so glad that you're here. We are a house of prayer for all people, and you are always welcome amongst us. So I hope that you will come back and see us often. And if this is your first time in the cathedral, you are doubly welcome. We're so glad to have you. Honest to God series is an ongoing series here at the cathedral. That's a very important one for us. It gives us an opportunity to bring together people of faith and of great accomplishment. People who are accomplished in a variety of different fields, in a variety of different faiths, and to talk about the intersection of faith and leadership, faith and service, and to see how faith influences and forms people who also serve as great leaders. And there's often wonderful takeaways from that experience. And so tonight we have three wonderful guests, and I'm going to introduce one of them, Michael Gerson, and I'm going to let Michael introduce our other two guests. We always have three guests, and Michael will serve not only as a guest to add his own journey about his faith and his profession, but he will also be moderating the conversation as well. For those of you who don't know Michael Gerson, he is a nationally syndicated columnist for the Washington Post. He is the author of several books, including Heroic Conservatism, and co-author of City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era. He appears regularly on the PBS NewsHour, Face the Nation, and numerous other programs. Michael Gerson is a senior advisor at ONE, a bipartisan organization dedicated to fight against extreme poverty and preventable diseases. Until 2006, Michael Gerson was a top aide to President George W. Bush as assistant to the President for Policy and Strategic Planning. Prior to that appointment, he served in the White House as Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Presidential Speechwriting, and Assistant to the President for Speechwriting and Policy Advisor. A most talented man and a wonderful friend to this cathedral. Along with Michael Gerson, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Francis Collins and Dr. Jennifer Wiseman. Would you please join me in welcoming the three of them to the platform?
Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be in this extraordinary place once again, and an honor to be with these panelists. The heavens, we are reliably told, declare the glory of God. Yet scientists are about half as likely as the general public to believe in God or a higher power. Some clearly believe there is a tension between psalmist and scientist. Our two guests tonight do not, and our goal is to explore why. And we're really privileged to be joined by two scientists on the cutting edge of knowledge and excellence. Dr. Jennifer Wiseman is an astronomer, a senior astrophysicist at the Goddard Space Center focused on star and planet formation. She has also taken a keen interest in the relationship between science and society, and now directs the dialogue on science, ethics, and religion at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Francis Collins is a physician and scientist who directed the Human Genome Project in its historic quest to sequence the human DNA instruction book. He has served under two presidents as the director of NIH, and has written a wonderful book, The Language of God, that argues for the essential harmony of language and faith. Please join me in welcoming these two wonderful guests. A few brief housekeeping things. Both of these distinguished scientists are speaking tonight in their capacity as private citizens, not as representatives of the wonderful institutions they serve. And keep in mind that we're going to be taking some questions, so be thinking as we talk. Jennifer and Francis, you are both active scientific researchers. So I want to start by giving each of you the chance to speak briefly about developments on the frontiers of your field. Jennifer, why don't you start us off?
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, and thanks to all of you for coming out on this frigidly cold night. I hope you're feeling warm and comfortable here. And I hope you noticed something else as you were walking into the cathedral. I'm sure you were walking very quickly, but the moon is beautiful. So always take a time to look up and be inspired. And so I want to, each of us are going to show a few slides just to show you a little bit about what we do, what we think about, and to stimulate our conversation tonight. So if we could start with my presentation, and I'm wondering if I will be able to see the same thing that you, there we go, okay. I want to show you a little bit about what we're learning about the heavens and a little bit about what we're trying to do to stimulate better societal dialogue about the relationship of science and the other values that we have as human beings. Now that could take hours and hours, but I have about 5 minutes or so. So we'll try to get through the universe very quickly, okay? This is an image that I hope will just dazzle you just to start out with. This is an image taken with a camera on a famous space telescope, the Hubble Space Telescope. And it is an image of stars, but it's not a view that you would likely see from the ground. Have any of you ever seen this many stars this close together? No, this is the core of a globular cluster, and we can only tease out these star-from-star differences by having the high angular resolution that a telescope in space allows. I think you can also see the beauty in this image. As you look at these stars, star differs from star in splendor. There's a Bible verse to that effect, and if you can figure out where that is, you get extra credit at your next service you attend. But you can see that stars are different from one another, and they are beautiful, and they are numerous. And if our sun were in this cluster, it would be like one of the smaller whitish-greenish objects in the field. Next slide, please. We're using different kinds of technology to understand the universe, and we need them all to get the full picture. No one telescope or instrument gives the full story of what we're understanding, and so I'm very appreciative of developments in technology. As you know, technology can be used for good things or for bad things, depending on why it's developed and who's using it, but I think in this case, in the development of optics and astronomy, the technology is being used for something very good, which is to illuminate to humanity the universe and help us think about where we fit in. So here's just some examples of different types of telescopes. There are telescopes in space. That's the one on the top there. That happens to be the Hubble Space Telescope, the most famous telescope orbiting the Earth. But there are other telescopes in space as well, and they each have their own unique niche of being able to see certain wavelengths of light in the sky or other capabilities. We also need and use telescopes on the ground. On the lower right, you see the ALMA Observatory. That's an array of radio telescopes in South America that are perceptive of what we call millimeter and submillimeter wavelength radiation that comes from deep within interstellar clouds where new stars are forming. The Hubble telescope cannot see into those deep clouds. They're opaque in many wavelengths, but these radio telescopes can see farther in. And the lower left are the Keck telescopes, an example of telescopes on tops of mountains. Here you see the clouds below. These telescopes are on the top of what we hope is a dormant volcano in Hawaii. But all these different telescopes are like different musical instruments in an orchestra, giving a different piece of information that all together gives us a better understanding of what we're trying to understand about stars or galaxies or planets. Next slide, please. And so we find that the universe that we live in is beautiful. and active, that stars are still forming out of interstellar gas and clouds, and then those newly formed stars light up the leftover surrounding gas and beautiful clouds, beautiful nebulae. And now we know that many of those stars form with planets around them. Next slide, please. We're even seeing things we didn't expect to be able to see. Maybe some of you heard the news recently of a black hole being imaged by a very special observatory, a collection of telescopes that were able to perceive the radiation right at the edge of a black hole, which once inside that black hole, light cannot escape. And the interesting thing is that the mathematical theories and physical theories that had been predicted for many decades of what we might see came out to be exactly what we saw. Next slide, please. We also just see great beauty. This is another one of these striking images of stars recently birthed out of dense gas, lighting up the surrounding gas, lower mass stars taking longer to form, still forming in that interstellar gas. The interplay and the activity is quite striking. Next slide, please. These clouds of gas and dust fill the volume of what we call galaxies. A galaxy is a collection of gas, dust, and billions, sometimes hundreds of billions of stars. So many stars that the light all blends together as we see it from afar. We think our own Milky Way galaxy might look something like this one, but we can't get all the way out yet to take a selfie, so we have to kind of look around from within and perceive. But just if you imagine our own sun being just one star along one of those outer spiral arms, and then imagine hundreds of billions of more just in our own galaxy, it's mind-blowing. And if you look carefully at this image, you'll see some beautiful galaxies in the background. Next slide, please. And we now know that galaxies are in fact numerous. You know, we live in a fortunate time. It's only been the last century that we've even really understood that there are galaxies outside of our own Milky Way galaxy. And indeed there are. This is my favorite image from the Hubble Space Telescope, which is what's called the ultra deep field. By focusing on a position in space where there aren't very many nearby stars and just collecting light for days, we see this image of thousands of little smudges of light. Each one of these is a galaxy, like our Milky Way, that could contain billions or even hundreds of billions of stars. And if we imagine this extrapolated around the entire sky, this is the kind of universe that we live in. And it really is mind-boggling, to me anyway. I hope it is to you too. Next slide, please. And in fact, some of those galaxies are closer to us, some of them farther away. And to me, one of the most fascinating advances in astronomy is being able to tease out the distances of these different galaxies, and the light that's traveled to us from these galaxies has taken time. So the ones that are farther away, we're seeing them as they were when the light began that journey, sometimes millions of years ago, sometimes billions of years ago. And so when you pull out the galaxies by their distances and kind of line them up like in this image, you actually see that galaxies have changed over time. The ones farther in space and time are on the right, the ones closer are on the left. And you can see that over time, galaxies have merged together, they've grown more massive, they've had generations of stars come and go to create heavier elements, elements that we need now in our epoch to form planets and to support life on at least one of those planets. Next slide, please. And of course, we wonder about those planets. Are there other planets around other stars? Is there life out there? Well, we now know the answer to the first question. There certainly are planets outside our solar system orbiting other stars. We didn't even know that when I was in school, and now we know of thousands of them. And now the race is on with technology to try to find whether or not any of those planets are habitable and what they're like, and to build better telescopes to characterize them better. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a real system, but an artist's conception of one of these exoplanet systems outside of our own solar system. This one with 6 planets in tight orbits around its parent star. Next slide. So science and technology are impacting nearly everything about life today, right? Next slide. Here's some examples. Think about it. Science and technology, in fact, everything we do, even in practical and philosophical ways that can include what we eat, our agriculture, communication, space exploration, education, what we understand about animals, in terms of who animals are and how we relate to them, and do they have rights and needs, environment, our health, our genetics, should we edit genes, the brain, neuroscience, our defense, and it even informs art, literature, music, and more. So science and technology impact everything about human life in our era. Next slide, please. And in fact, here's the cover of Science magazine, the flagship magazine of the AAAS, where I represent a dialogue program talking about tomorrow's Earth. How should we use our scientific understanding and even our technology to address and to live in what we think is going to be the Earth of tomorrow? Next slide, please. And should we be using our technology? We are using our technology to transform biology. Is this good? Is this bad? Is it both? Francis will tell us. Next slide. I want to let you know about the program I direct. As part of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS has many public engagement programs regarding science, and one of them is this one called the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, or DOSER program. Next slide. DOSER is designed to build communication between religious communities and ethicists and scientists about advances in science and technology. So we're a relationship builder group. And this is a group of seminary professors who are in the Hall of Human Origins right here in the Museum of Natural History at a convening that we had to talk about how science could be brought more powerfully into seminary education for future clergy. Next slide, please. We find that while there are many great books and articles about science and religion, but our forte is to actually bring people together into communication, scientists and faith communities. And that's very powerful. And so I hope you'll check out our website and our activities. Next slide, please. And this is how you can do it, AAAS.org/DOSER. And we're active on Facebook and Twitter, too. Next slide, please. So all of this is about us on planet Earth and how we can think about faith and science together in a way that enhances, I think, life for all on planet Earth. And that's my little intro. Thank you very much.
The scale and beauty of those slides is just extraordinary. But now we're going from the very large to the very small. And Francis, what's going on in your world?
Well, let me say, first of all, what a privilege it is to be here in this beautiful and sacred space and to be up here on stage with two of my friends, Jennifer Wiseman and Michael Gerson. I've been looking forward to this opportunity to talk about this interface between science and faith. And I'm glad we started off with this remarkable demonstration of the awe that science can bring to all of us who have a chance to take part in it. I think sometimes people are afraid that science is getting rid of all the awe. That's not been my experience in any way. It adds to the experience of amazement, of a sense of things being so much more beautiful and complicated than you thought they could be. And that's true in my space as well. As a physician, as a scientist, as somebody who had the privilege of leading the Human Genome Project and now serves as director of the largest supporter of the biomedical research in the world, the National Institutes of Health, every day brings us a new experience of amazement and awe. And I'd like to tell you briefly about a few of those before Mike begins the inquisition and starts asking really tough questions. So if I could have my slides, please. This is a bit of a joke, but just to remind you that, after all, you are a product of the DNA that came from both of your parents, which is, I guess, why this child is wearing the particular outfit that he is. You get half from mom and half from dad, and we knew all of that a long time ago, but what we now have is the opportunity to be able to read that script. Next. This is that amazing molecule, DNA, shown spilling out of a cell, and which is an information carrier of the most elegant sort. It has just 4 letters in its alphabet. They're actually chemical bases, but we abbreviate them A, C, G, and T. And I'm sorry it's not A, B, C, and D. I know people would have liked that better, but that's just the names they have. And it's this double helix, which you can see unwound there so you could see the letters. And A on one strand always pairs with T on the other, and C always pairs with G. So if you get a little damage, you can fix it by using the other strand as a template. An elegant system. All living things use this same system. If you're looking for evidence of descent from a common ancestor, this is a pretty powerful one, given that all organisms do, in fact, use this same language and this same molecule to pass information from parent to child and down through the generations and the millennia. Now, DNA sits inside, next slide, the nucleus of the cell, and I think it's a really good analogy to talk about it as an instruction book. An instruction book that's written in this special language. It's a pretty big book. If you took those letters of the DNA code, of which you have 3 billion in a copy you got from your mom and 3 billion you got from dad, and were to print them out on pages of usual thickness in a usual font size with a usual margins, and pile those papers on top of each other, the information in a single cell would be about the height of the Washington Monument down here. So there's a case of awe, isn't it? You're carrying that around in each one of your trillions of cells. And every time the cell divides, it's got to copy that, and you hope it gets it right. And occasionally there's a glitch, and sometimes that can cause trouble, although most of the time the glitch happens in a place that's not all that vulnerable. So we knew that as well, that DNA was the information molecule. We knew about the double helix back in 1953 with Watson and Crick. But what's really changed everything is we now have figured out how to read the book. Next, please. And that was the Human Genome Project, which I had the privilege of leading over the course of 13 years, and which in 2003 produced the first reference sequence of those 3 billion letters of the human DNA instruction book. This was an amazing project in scale, involving 2,500 scientists in 6 countries, working together over 13 years, giving all the data away every 24 hours, not worrying about who got the credit, and feeling that they were part of an amazing historical adventure, and we all were. But of course, once you have that information, you could start looking at it on your computer, and it would still be a lot of A, C, G, and T. And you have to figure out how to read this language and how to make sense out of it. And that's very much now where we have all been engaged. Following the first reference sequence, I stayed involved at NIH, leading the effort to try to add information value to the human genome sequence. And that was a mad rush of exciting new information related to function, but also related to the differences between all of us. Because while we're 99.9% the same at the DNA level, 0.1% of 3 billion is still a big number. And so we have interesting differences that may play a role in our risks of illness, which is something we'd really like to know. After doing that for a bit, I got a bit restless and walked away from NIH thinking I would do something else. But next slide, I got called back. So in 2009, President Obama asked me to come back to NIH and serve as the director, overseeing all of the landscape of medical research, which is truly daunting to contemplate, including things that I didn't know nearly as much about, like neuroscience and immunology, but which I tried to be as quick a study as I could be. And now, just over 10 years after that appointment, I am continuing to find this an enormous privilege to be able to oversee the progress that we can make at a time of exceptional scientific progress, much of it built upon technology. So I might just give you a couple examples of that, and then we're going to go to Mike's questions. Next slide. One thing that we are now engaged in, which I hope I might even recruit some of you to join, is how could we use this information about DNA, as well as everything we'd like to learn about each one of us, to try to do a better job of keeping people healthy. We're not just studying disease, we'd like to study health. The best way to do that and to understand individual differences is to start a very large cohort, that is a bunch of individuals who agree to take part over time, and ask them to share everything about what's happening to them medically, answering questionnaires, making their anonymized medical records available. Coming up, back up one more, we're not quite there yet. Well, we're going to get there. And this is what all of us is, inviting 1 million Americans to take part in this adventure. And basically make the information available with all of the individual identifiers stripped off to researchers who might have good ideas. So if you're interested in this, joinallofus.org. We're up to 330,000 people, and we're moving pretty quick, so this offer will expire if you don't jump on soon. It will be an adventure, and then one that I think we're all going to learn from. Now you can go to the next slide. Another area of intense interest is to try to understand how the most complicated biological structure that we know about does what it does, and that's the human brain. That image you see there is not a cartoon or an artist's rendition. That's actual data from a new kind of scan that allows you to look at the wiring diagram of the human brain in a normal individual. It's pretty breathtaking to see how the architecture here is so exquisite. We are in the midst of inventing and applying a whole host of technologies that will allow us to understand what's happening inside your brain when you're carrying out a fairly complicated process, absorbing visual information, mounting some sort of motor effort, laying down a memory and retrieving it. All of those things we really need to understand, and which we've been, frankly, out of reach, but maybe they're not anymore. So this is one to watch as well, with obvious implications for Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's and epilepsy and autism and schizophrenia and depression and all those other things that we know affect the brain. Next. I have to tell you about this one because this has been such an exhilarating moment in just the last 10 days. When I was a researcher at the University of Michigan, before I came to NIH, my lab was focused very intensively on trying to find the cause, that is, the genetic mutation that causes cystic fibrosis. And this was the 1980s, and it was really tough doing that. There was no genome project. You were sort of feeling your way in the dark. But ultimately, we were successful 30 years ago this year in finding the gene, and that was published in Science magazine with this boy in the front, that's Danny Bissett, who's affected with cystic fibrosis. So 30 years later, after an incredible amount of hard work, understanding what the nature of this misspelled protein might be and how you could potentially compensate for it with drug therapy, we have arrived at an amazing juncture. By the way, when this paper was published, next, there was a wonderful entry that somebody gave me from an 8-year-old girl. And what it says is, today is the most best day ever in my life. They found a gene, G-E-A-N, for cystic fibrosis. Here is JH in 1989. Well, I want to show you a picture of JH now. Next. Now, there she is with her daughter. And the reason for the excitement is that just 10 days ago, the results of a clinical trial with a triple drug therapy were revealed at a meeting in Nashville where I had the privilege of being present. And the results of the trial were better than anybody could have imagined. And 90% of individuals with cystic fibrosis will now, it seems, be in a circumstance of basically having a chronic disease that requires drug therapy, but no longer facing the profound likelihood of serious shortness of their life. And we worked a long time to get there, and it is amazing to be able to see that now. And by the way, next, there's Danny Bissett also. He's doing pretty well. So these treatments coming along in my lifetime is like a gift that I wasn't sure I would have the privilege to see. Next, we will probably want to talk a little bit about CRISPR, because everybody is talking about CRISPR. So what is this? It's an abbreviation. I won't even tell you what it stands for because it won't make a lot of sense, and I'll probably forget because we all say CRISPR without remembering exactly what it stands for. But here's the point. It is a new development just coming along the last 4 or 5 years that allows recombinant DNA to have more power than I ever thought it would. It's basically find and replace in the human genome like you would do in your word processor, where you have the ability to program the system to go and identify a specific place where you want to make a change without touching the rest of the instruction book, and to do so with high efficiency. And imagine what that means if you're talking about people who have a genetic disease where there's a misspelling that you potentially would really like to fix. Are we doing this? It's underway in clinical trials. Next. And it's particularly underway for a disease that I think we desperately have needed new answers for. The very first molecular disease, sickle cell anemia, which affects 100,000 individuals in the United States, mostly African Americans, because this is a particular genetic variation that's selected for in places where malaria is common. And so that has had its imprint on the West African population, and that's been carried along as they've moved to other places. But it is now possible, because this is one letter out of place, to think about doing something about that. Here's a picture taken from our own NIH Clinical Center, where Janelle Stevenson, that you see lying in bed there with sickle cell disease, is about to undergo a gene therapy for her disease. And maybe some of you saw this on 60 Minutes a few months ago. Next, we'll show you what she looks like now. She's become a jiu-jitsu expert. And she is not just improved. By every measure we could say right now, she's cured of this genetic disease. And that's not the only person with this condition. Next, it shows you another person in Tennessee who's going through another version of this one using CRISPR. This is really starting to work. That gives us all great hope, and it is an inspiration to be involved in this kind of effort. Next slide. But we do have to think about the consequences. We are talking about here modifying the human DNA information, the instruction book for human biology. That's the book of life. There is an intense conversation going on right now about whether we should be doing this if it means modifying the DNA of an embryo, because that would affect all the cells of that person and would be passed on to the next generation. What I told you about with sickle cell disease doesn't come anywhere near affecting the heritable part. It just fixes the problem in the bone marrow. And that's pretty consistent with other things we've done, including bone marrow transplants. But to contemplate doing this for the whole person, that is a major leap that many of us think is not time to do. We don't have enough information to know whether that's safe. And on top of that, that raises for most of us serious philosophical and theological questions about what we're doing to modify our very essence. So some people are a little nervous, therefore, about gene therapy and wonder if we should be doing this. Let me just finish with one picture to show you why I think we should, but we have to be thoughtful about it. Next. One of the most tragic conditions that any of us who are geneticists see is this one called spinal muscular atrophy, where these children are born a little floppy at birth, and then over the course of the next few months, clearly are developing worse and worse motor tone. They don't sit up. They'll never learn to walk. And this is like ALS, except it's on an infant. It's a genetic disorder. Children with this disorder rarely live past 1 year of life. We know the exact misspelling. So motivated people were determined to figure out if there's a way that we could correct that by putting the normal copy of the gene into a viral vector that could be delivered to the spinal cord, which is where the problem is. Now that seems like a very tall order, and I would not have expected that this would work in my lifetime. But that has now been applied in a few instances, and if it is applied early enough before the child has developed really serious spinal cord problems, the results can be pretty dramatic. Remember, this is a condition that rarely allows survival past 1 year. Let me show you a video with no audio of Mateo. Can you start that next slide? This little boy had spinal muscular atrophy. He should not have survived. Not only did he survive, he's a pretty normal looking kid. Yeah, push that elevator button, stand up on your toes. This is just breathtaking to imagine. And now watch, he's going to go outside with his dad and hang on the monkey bars. Every time I watch that, I get a little choked up. This is such an amazing moment to see that it's possible to save a little child's life with this kind of genetic therapy. So we have to, if we're ethical, figure out how to do that more and more, at the same time keeping our eyes on where the limits ought to be. Finally, next slide. For me, as a person who's both a scientist and who became a Christian in my 20s, I find great joy in having science and faith in my life, and I don't find I have to build a wall between different parts of my brain to contemplate those things. And I love this comparison of a rose window, rather like the one here in the cathedral, next to the DNA double helix, looking down the long axis where it starts to look very much in the same view. Again, science gives you a chance to see beauty. Science gives you a chance to experience awe. Science also gives you a chance to worship, if you're somebody who has the ability and the willingness to think of this as not a random set of circumstances. If you're interested, and maybe this will come up a bit next slide, in learning more about how believers, in this case Christians, find ways to bring together science and faith that are complementary and harmonious and not in conflict, I'd refer you to the BioLogos Foundation, biologos.org, which is turned out to be pretty much the most heavily traveled meeting place for people who are seeking ways to understand how to put those two books together, the book of God's words, the Bible, and the book of God's works, nature. And I believe they can be merged in a wonderfully harmonious and satisfying way. So thank you.
Francis, before we go on, I just want to ask briefly, what did it feel like to announce this cystic fibrosis change? What was going through your head?
Once in a while in your life as a physician or a scientist or any of us, you have this moment of realizing this is something I'll always remember. I'll remember where I was. I'll remember what happened. I'll remember being surrounded by a certain group of like-minded people. That Friday morning in Nashville was one of those moments. I had the chance to speak a little bit about the 30-year stretch of this research, and then to have the presentation from a remarkable physician scientist about exactly what the outcome had been of these trials. And then I was asked to come back up with my guitar and encourage everybody to sing a song about this, a song I wrote many years ago called Dare to Dream. But now the dream was coming true, and people were on their feet, they were singing, they were crying, I was doing some of the same. Unforgettable moment, but let no one imagine this happens easily. This is 30 years of incredible hard work across public and private sectors and thousands of scientists and lots of blind alleys and things that didn't work to get to this point of celebration.
Obviously, we're in a golden age of science in many ways, but we're speaking in a sacred place, and there are plenty of people who find tension between the two, that the topic and setting would be mismatched. There are both scientists and religious believers who argue that faith and science are somehow incompatible. Why is that wrong, and how did you come to that view, both of you?
I think very simply, it's a misunderstanding of the nature of science. I love science. I'm a scientist, but science is a wonderful tool. It's a method for thinking through problems, for addressing the natural world, how the natural world works. And for that, I am grateful. But science as a tool and as a process is not the right tool to address all the questions of life, the philosophical questions, the questions of why are we here, capital W, and we can address why we are here, little w, in terms of cause and effect of physical forces in nature, but why are there these physical forces of nature in the first place, and how should we live, and is there a God, and how would we relate to God if God exists, how should we treat one another? These are questions that science is really not the best tool to answer. And so I think in the very most simplistic level, it's really understanding what science is powerful for and use science to its ultimate extent for what science can do, but don't try to use science to be kind of a religion in and of itself, because it's very unsatisfying. Science cannot answer all the issues and all the questions that we have as human beings.
I agree with very much the way Jennifer puts the answer forward. For me, because I was an atheist in college and in graduate school studying chemistry, and only when I went to medical school and had the opportunity and the challenge of sitting next to people who are facing the end of their life. Did I really have to address whether my own formulation of atheism had been based on rational thought or whether it was just the answer I wanted because it wouldn't require too much of me? And I had to admit that I hadn't really thought it through. And then I began to realize, with some help from other thoughtful people who've written about this over the centuries, that actually, while science will never provide you with a proof of God's existence, it does provide a lot of interesting pointers. And as G.K. Chesterton has said, in the face of those pointers, atheism is in fact the least defensible of the positions one might take, because it's an assertion of a universal negative. I know there is no God. Scientists aren't supposed to make those kinds of assertions when evidence might come along to prove them wrong. So yes, this was, as Chesterton said, the most daring of all dogmas, and I wasn't sure I wanted to follow that. But then look at the pointers. Why is there something instead of nothing? Science is not going to help you with that. What happened before the Big Bang? And if you have to say there was a creator before the Big Bang, a creator couldn't very well also be limited in space and time, or you haven't solved the problem. You have an infinite regress, as they would call it, which seems to call out then for something outside of nature in order to account for what's here. Mathematics. I see we have one Nobel Prize winner in physics here, Bill Phillips, another Nobel Prize winner in physics, Wigner, talked about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Why does it work? Why does a mathematician or a physicist, when they get it right, they know their theory is right because it's beautiful and simple? Why should the universe behave that way? Sounds like there's a mathematician at work here. And then, just quickly, there's this whole issue of the fine-tuning of the universe, that there are all these constants that determine the behavior of matter and energy. And if they were off by 1 part in a billion, the whole thing wouldn't work anymore. You would not end up with anything interesting or complicated. You'd have particles flying apart in very simple ways for all eternity. And that is not what happened. Looks like somebody kind of set the dials. Now, somebody will come back and say, well, what about the multiverse? And I will say, okay, takes faith to believe in that. My faith is much more comfortable with the idea that there's actually an intention here, but I won't expect to convince you of that. Anyway, all those pointers are there, and that got me to the perspective of realizing that at least accepting of a deist position was pretty comfortable. Now, to get from there to theism, that's another step. We could talk about that, but I'm going on too long, and Mike has more questions.
Sure. When J.B.S. Haldane was asked if there's anything that could be concluded about God from the study of natural history, he replied, an inordinate fondness for beetles. There are, in fact, 380,000 species of beetles. What can creation tell us about the nature of God?
That's a good question that people have grappled with for many, many, many centuries. And I'm not a theologian or a philosopher, but I honestly think it kind of works better to go in the direction of, if you start from believing or at least being open to the idea of God and purpose, what could nature tell you a little bit about the nature of God, as opposed to trying to use nature to prove God or something that doesn't work well, at least for me. So looking through the eyes of someone who is a believer and, open to the idea of God, when I look at nature, the universe, I see things like amazing creativity, amazing power, amazing patience, amazing processes. I mean, the idea that the atoms in our bodies were literally forged in stars. So we are literally, you and I, connected to the universe is a really beautiful and mind-boggling reality. So in that sense, it tells me something more about the nature of God's creativity, power, provision for life, even if it's taken billions of years for the universe to get to the point where life as we know it could exist and thrive. That's what I glean in terms of learning something a little bit more about the character of God, as opposed to trying to use nature to prove God. What would you say?
No, I think that's well said. I'm going to take it one further step because it was important in my own trajectory here trying to figure out what's the nature of God, and is this a God who cares about me, or a God who sort of did the creative thing in an amazing way and then lost interest or had other things to do? And this is where my path was very much influenced by the remarkable writings of C.S. Lewis, and the very first chapter of his probably most widely read book called Mere Christianity is entitled Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. Now, what did that mean? And that was leaping from all of the wonderful pointers that we've been talking about from nature to our own sense of morality, that we do, and this is true down through the centuries of human species, believe that there is such a thing as right and wrong. We will disagree sometimes vehemently about what fits into the right category and what fits into the wrong category, but we don't disagree that there is such a thing as right and wrong. And where does that come from? And this is a really interesting topic to get into with a very strict, hard-nosed atheist, because they will say this has to be coming from some other influence, probably evolutionary forces that have caused us to behave in certain ways as if there was something called right and wrong because it helped us to propagate our species. Those arguments have always left me a little cold because they seem to discount actions that you would call radical altruism, where individuals actually sacrifice or potentially sacrifice their own lives for people they don't even know. And that's hard to model in an evolutionary perspective. But even if you'll give me, or they will put forward that that could be explained on the basis of some evolutionary survival mechanism, it still leaves you then hungry to explain, well, what is then the basis of right and wrong? And even, I think, the most determined atheist has trouble saying that there is no such thing and that we've been basically hoodwinked all along to believe that right and wrong matter. That's a hard one. If you're willing to go there and say it does have significance and we can't fully explain it on natural grounds, then if you were looking for a signpost to a God that cares about us, that seems like a pretty interesting one. And it would also say that that would be a God who is committed to what is right and good and holy. And therefore, if we are interested in learning more about that God, we should probably strive to do the same. That is putting into a few sentences, or maybe more than I should, something that took me 2 years to get to. But it continues to be a compelling part of this, not proof, but scientific set of evidences that lead one in the direction not just of a deist kind of God, but a theist kind of God who cares about us and who might even answer prayer.
I'd love to get to so many other topics, but Jennifer, I want to know what level of interest you're finding in the dialogue between scientific and religious communities, and how would the world be better if they got along better?
That's really interesting because, we often have a sense, I think, from popular culture that scientists are over here and religious people and communities are over there and they're at odds, or at least they don't have anything to do with each other. And yet we're finding that that is really not the case at all, that religious communities, congregations of many varieties are very interested in science. They seem to be very interested in science for its own sake, but also to use science more usefully in the ministries and the callings that they have to serve others in the world, and can do that better if they're scientifically informed. Scientists, on the other hand, whether they are people of personal faith or not, have often come to us at the AAAS and said, I want to be a better ambassador for science with the many, many religious people around me in my life and in my spheres of influence in my classrooms. How can we remove unnecessary barriers to this largely religious public towards science? Let's do a better job. So a lot of scientists really want there to be in our culture a much better interaction between scientists, and religious communities for the sake of a better society, because science works better if everyone is benefiting from it and is involved and excited in it. And faith communities work better, in a sense, in terms of both their sense of awe and wonder and worship and their sense of service to others if they're better informed by the gifts of knowledge that science brings us. And so we're finding quite a lot of enthusiasm for building constructive interactions, relationships in spaces that people might not expect in this regard.
Francis, briefly, you mentioned the possibility of ethical controversy in what you do. This seems especially true. The risks are especially difficult in the editing of human beings. What are the hard ethical lines that you think can be drawn?
Well, I mentioned briefly that we're both enormously excited about the ways in which gene editing can cure diseases and save lives if you limit it to the non-heritable part of the genome. But once you get into the heritable part, you've moved into a territory that we humans have not taken under our own responsibility for. And when you consider where that might lead us, you could imagine not just doing this to try to eliminate a misspelling that would cause a terrible disease, but also to try to improve things and try to utilize these technologies so that a well-off couple could choose the characteristics of their offspring in a way that they could never have done by themselves, but with a little tweaking of the genome here or there might result in what they saw as a better outcome. But then again, that is a change of uncertain consequences in the long term. Biology is pretty complicated. You change one thing, you might be changing other things without realizing. The safety issues here are substantial. But it would be passed on to future generations. For me, as a scientist, I think we are nowhere near the point of being able to understand what the consequences might be in terms of risks. And frankly, there is no compelling medical need to do this right now, and I could explain that if I had a little bit more time. There is no pressing urgency of manipulating the heritable part of the genome. But more than that, this does seem to me, of all the bioethical issues that I'm familiar with over my 35 years working in this field, and there have been others and still are, genetic discrimination, for instance, human-animal chimeras, stem cell research, I could go on. This one of all of them seems to me the most profound. Because if we decide to go down that road, and it has already been done by a scientist in China just about exactly a year ago, manipulating the DNA of 2 embryos that then resulted in 2 newborn girls. If we're going to do that across the board, I'm really going to raise my hand and say I'm not on board with this. And NIH is, in fact, very publicly not on board with this and arguing that the rest of the world needs to also put a moratorium in place for this. So we will not be undertaking those things for at least the next 5 years while we have a chance to really think about it and engage with society more broadly, who ought to have a say in something as profound as re-engineering our very species. That seems to me like one of those ethical issues that calls out for engagement between people who are believers, people who are non-believers, people who are scientists, people who are non-scientists. We got to figure out where we as a society stand. And it's not easy to figure out how to do that in a way that has any enforcement capability, because there is no international body that could basically say, here's the answer and you all have to follow this or there'll be trouble. Every country is going to have to take this on. Some are further along than others. I think we in the US are in a situation where this kind of activity would be illegal, but that's not true in many other places. So yeah, ethics is a big part of my life as well, and I think it has to be for any scientist who's engaged in life science right now, because these things keep coming up. But we need that input. Another reason why bringing people of faith and people of science interest together, and some of them being the same people, is a really important thing.
We're going to go to questions in just one second, but let me just follow up with a question. Can science find and impose its own rules, moral rules, or do they have to come from outside of science in order to be effective?
I think scientists are in a good position to know the facts. And certainly I've seen instances where people got very worked up about an ethical issue that was scientifically never going to happen. So that's not so useful. But scientists have a conflict of interest. They like to do science. That's what we do. And so if scientists alone are making decisions about what lines should be crossed and what should not, that doesn't seem like the way in which a free and open society would be best served. There has to be input.
Now let's go to some questions, and I have just one request, that questions be in the form of a question.
Okay, I can hold it. Okay, boy, I get to ask the first question. I'm really excited. I know you're here as private citizens, but I appeal to your day jobs. I recently had the privilege of seeing a new lay-directed scientific documentary called Human Nature. Some of you may have heard about it. It's actually about the CRISPR technology that you had mentioned, Dr. Collins. And it's very well done. And I'm just wondering if the three of you can help spread it around, because my personal belief is that education is the most important thing. And when people understand a little bit more about some of the issues you mentioned, which you did very crisply, and this movie took an hour and a half to do, I think people might understand the situation better.
How do we do education surrounding these issues?
It's always a tough question. Scientists are not always the most coherent educators about these topics. Sometimes we get all tangled up in jargon and just confuse everybody. I think, somewhat gratified that in this situation, because CRISPR, gene editing, is so dramatic, that it has attracted the attention of a lot of very good communicators. There are now books written about it. Jennifer Doudna, who's one of the inventors of this, has a book about CRISPR that's worth reading. And certainly, when one looks at the media, there are lots of things coming out. Some of them a little bit starry-eyed about the benefits. I'm a little starry-eyed about the benefits too, but many of them focused particularly on the risks of the heritable interventions. We at NIH, we try to be the source of information. If you go to our website, a little plug there, nih.gov, you'll see a lot of information about CRISPR, but it's not sufficient. And again, we probably are seen as having a conflict of interest because we're scientists and we like to do science.
Let's try to get to a few more questions, so make sure that we...
Well, first, I want to thank both of you, not just for being here tonight, but for devoting so much of your lives to helping all of us understand these kinds of questions. My question is this. As a scientist and a person of faith, I think the hardest thing that I have to deal with is the question of theodicy. How am I to answer an atheist friend who says, I will not believe in a God who allows the kind of suffering that we see all around us in the world? Now, forget about moral evil that's due to bad moral choices that we freely make. But there's a lot of natural evil in the world, disease and destruction. What do you say to that atheist friend who says, I cannot believe in that kind of God? And this is for both of you.
Yeah. We could have a seminar on this topic, but if there any brief answer to one of the deepest questions of humanity. So.
I will just say that I have many of the same questions, all right? So, in fact, it worries me a little bit when I hear people say some of the things that sometimes I say, that, the universe is so wonderful and beautiful, and doesn't that all just make us feel warm and fuzzy about God? And then, of course, we see a lot of destructive natural forces that cause great grief and great suffering. What kind of God with godly power would allow this to happen? And I can't answer that question. But I think the fact that we have that question, that we see something that we see doesn't seem quite right, that seems wrong, that in itself to me is evidence that there's such a thing as good and bad and right and wrong, that the fact that we're disturbed by these things at all says to me that there's something real about things not being all perfect out there, and that we are sensitized to that. I think that's part, if you will, for people of faith, of feeling that, or understanding that we're made in the image of God. We have a perception of good and bad in some weird sense. And I think at least the God of the Bible is described as a God who grieves about suffering, who recognizes suffering, who promises a future where there will be ultimately an end to this kind of paradigm, but has allowed freedom for now, for these freedom of our choice and freedom of nature to work itself out in a way that sometimes causes suffering, and a God that participates with us in that. That's not satisfying for everyone. It's not completely satisfying for me, but I think that's one way of looking at it.
Well said. I do think we have to recognize that when there is suffering that we might be able to do something about, we're called to help with that. That is, in many ways, what motivates a lot of scientists who work in medicine, is this sense that suffering shouldn't be happening, whether it's a child with cystic fibrosis or somebody who's had a terrible car accident and needs to be patched up. And so we are called as modeling ourselves after Jesus to try to be healers within the limits that we're able to with the tools of medicine. But it's the toughest question, Bill. That was Nobel Prize winner Bill Phillips, in case you're wondering, asking the hardest question. Didn't you know he would do that? The Odyssey. And again, as Jennifer said, I don't think we should ever imagine we have an easy answer to that. I do know that the less dramatic forms of suffering can in fact be occasions of growth. I think in my own lifespan, I have learned relatively less when things were going really smoothly than when I hit a bump in the road and was challenged and things seemed to be running the wrong direction, and you sort of reach out in that circumstance maybe more easily and clearly to God than you do when you think you've got it all under control. And finally, I would say, according to, along the lines of what Jennifer just said, I do know that when I see terrible suffering or experience something like that myself, that I serve a particular Savior who suffered more on the cross than I could ever imagine, and therefore understands what suffering is about. There's no way you could say that the God of Christianity is unaware of the experience.
I think that people often underestimate the moral achievement of science. I saw that in like the AIDS crisis, the development of AIDS drugs that have saved tens of millions of people. We looked at some examples here today, but I think that sometimes people don't understand that scientists are actually fighting that suffering in very practical ways. So.
And while you're saying that, most of you may not know that one of the main authors of that program, PEPFAR, that has saved the lives of tens of millions of people from HIV/AIDS was Michael Gerson.
Let's get to some more questions, please.
I'm going to do one more up front, then Margaret and I are going to work our way forward from the back.
Okay.
Dr. Collins, you made a distinction between heritable and inheritable, and I'm puzzled. I don't understand the difference. Could you explain, please? What's the difference?
Sure. By my definition, I think the words are always a little complicated. Heritable means that you've made a change in the cells of a person's body that are going to get passed on to the next generation. So if I've modified an embryo and that embryo grows up to become a person, all the cells of that person have been modified by what I did, and that includes the sperm and the eggs that will result. And so you've passed that on unwittingly to future generations who might not appreciate it if it didn't turn out well. Non-heritable, talk about sickle cell disease. The goal there is not to modify all the cells in the body. It's to modify those very special cells in the bone marrow from which blood cells are derived. If you could fix those, you would fix sickle cell disease. But you've done nothing that will be passed on to their offspring. That's the non-heritable kind of gene editing. Most things that we're talking about are non-heritable. Unless you're working with sperm or eggs or embryos, you're essentially in the non-heritable zone, which is much less ethically fraught.
Let's go on to the back somewhere.
So, I myself am a scientist, and as both a scientist and a person of faith, one of the things I pay attention to most, that I think is probably one of the biggest ethical issues in our time, is climate change. What's your thought on what we can do as private citizens and what the ethical implications of it are for you as people of faith?
I think climate change is perhaps the most or one of the most profound issues humanity is facing right now. So, and this is true for all of us on the planet, and I think we haven't quite come to grips with how fast it's happening and what the impacts are and will be for people around the globe. So science at its best can help us understand why this is happening and what we can do about it in terms of practically speaking. And then that feeds into how do we do that? That's policy. Faith communities that care about the creation care is often a theme of many faith communities. How do we care for the creation that we understand doesn't belong to us? It's God's creation. We are to be good stewards. How do we do that better? How do we care for people around the world when it's often the people who are most vulnerable and have the fewest choices, the poor of the world, who are the most affected by global climate change and weather changes that are quite severe? And so I think it's a very important challenge. I will say that I don't think anybody intended this to happen when we started using fossil fuels decades ago. Nobody, I don't think, had some sort of evil desire to bring disaster to the planet. It was just using energy to live our lives. But now that we understand a little better just the physics of it, this shouldn't be political, right? I really shouldn't be political. It really should be noticing cause and effect just from the physics of what's happening, but then understanding the broader impacts to humanity, and that's where we should bring in policy, faith communities, and civic societies around the world to address the problem.
Jennifer, why did it get political? There are a lot of scientific matters that don't,
Yes.
that are not. This one is highly polarized. How did that happen?
Well, I am not a political scientist. I don't know exactly why it happened, but I think the problem comes in when there's something that needs to change in terms of the way society functions that maybe has economic ramifications, and then that really, anything with the word economic in it has a lot of interest, shall you say, in various interest groups. And then it gets into I don't want to use the phrase culture wars, but into the idea that people trust different voices and different spokespeople. We're all like that. We all trust some voices more than others, and unfortunately, those voices have become unnecessarily polarized on this issue, which I really think shouldn't be politicized. This is an issue that affects everybody on the planet, and we need to find some unified way of addressing it.
Let's do another question. Moving upward.
Hello. Just a science student hoping to break into the field in the next few years. An argument that I've heard from a lot of people in atheist circles, or non-religious circles rather, would be that to explain creation, even if you say that all of what we understand from science about creation is still true, that it all stems from a God. Some might argue that that's a less elegant, a less, I guess, beautiful or satisfying solution than saying that it's just how things came into existence randomly, that we were just lucky in the cosmic game of chance. How would you argue that a God being the source of that is more beautiful, more equitable, more favorable?
Some people argue for a multiverse that covers all of the options, beautiful and not. but I'm interested.
Yeah, that, again, I mentioned this whole issue about the fine-tuning of the universe, which makes our universe from sort of probability theory extremely unlikely, because all of these constants had to have almost exactly the value they do, the gravitational constant, the speed of light, the strong and weak nuclear forces, and so on. And that seems unimaginably hard to defend unless you say there was a creator, or you say we are one of an almost infinite number of multiverse participants that had different values of these constants. And of course, we're here, so we had to be in the one that worked as far as this kind of complexity. The problem with that, again, as a scientific statement, is I have not heard a lot of assertions that we could ever actually observe those other universes. So you're rather stuck with that being a strong element of faith. So if somebody wants to put their faith in that and finds that coherent with other aspects of what they believe about what's real and what's not, I can't say that that's not a rational choice. It happens to go against some of the other evidences that I've mentioned, such as the fact that mathematics works, the fact that there is this moral law. When you put it all together, it seems to call out more to me, not as a proof, for a creator God who actually twiddled the dials to make it possible for our universe to be interesting and to give rise to sentient creatures with big brains who would have conversations like this in the National Cathedral on a very cold Tuesday night.
Let's do another.
Could I follow up on that a little bit? I just think these are different philosophical responses to the same set of scientific information sometimes. So I work with people all around me in the scientific community who basically accept the same scientific picture of the history of the universe and how we got here, scientifically and evolutionarily speaking, but who have different philosophical conclusions about what that means. And for some, they would say, look, we can explain everything through the physical laws of nature, of why we're here, even why we think the way we do can be explained through physical cause and effect, or at least could, at least philosophically or conceivably be explained someday that way. So we don't need some kind of God of the gaps that comes in and tweaks things to make things happen. We can explain it all. And others can say, hey, we can explain everything, same thing, by the physical forces of nature. We can explain why we're here. We can explain the cosmic history of the universe. Isn't it incredible that the forces of the universe work together to create this universe that can support life and to enable life to mature and evolve to the point where we can actually reflect on our own existence? What a strong evidence for God, So using the same information but coming to different philosophical conclusions is something that I encounter all the time. And just for me personally, the fact that we have a universe that is complex, beautiful, and enables self-reflecting life, such as ourselves, leans me more toward there must be purpose and a God category than the other choice. But not everybody is persuaded in that direction. I will say that for me, the fact that this goes on to an earlier conversation here, but the fact that we recognize good and evil, right and wrong, and that we're disturbed by it, actually, for me, is an evidence that the God of the Bible is credible, because that is what we're told in Scripture, is that there is good and evil and God cares about it. So.
I guess the problem comes when people view their view as science, as the only interpretation, because everything is physical.
I think the question is, what does the science tell us, and then what are the issues that are beyond science? Where does the science end and the philosophy and theology and the things beyond science begin? And is there any truth that science alone cannot fully address? And that's a philosophical question as well. Is science really the only arbiter of truth? Is there any truth out there that's not fully addressable by science alone? And that question has different answers from different people.
Yeah, just to put a word to it, I think the attitude that nothing that matters can be addressed in any way other than with science, that goes way outside the powers that science ought to really have ascribed to it. And that would be called by many of us scientism, which is a philosophical position, not necessarily based upon evidence. Science is the very best way to understand how nature works. It works really well to find out those answers. But when you try to use the tools of science to ask a question like, what's the meaning of love, and is there a God, and why do we have something instead of nothing, then if you're going to say science is in that space, I think you've crossed a line that's not science anymore, it's scientism.
Okay. Let's get another question.
Thank you so much for coming here this evening. Question is with regards to, you were to sit down tomorrow and you would open up the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and it was to say, we've actually met intelligent life. And so the intelligent life comes to the planet and they just start a dialogue. And you talk about the scientific universal laws. Would you expect that an enlightened being would also bring about a religious law or a religious understanding when they actually came to us? And could you have that dialogue that would exist as well as the scientific dialogue, but the religious dialogue as well?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of speculation about that in science fiction over the years of what these enlightened beings would bring once we encounter them. And that's a speculation in and of itself, that somehow beings beyond Earth would have somehow more enlightenment than we have. We don't know. I mean, what's fascinating to me right now is that we are finding scads of planets outside our solar system, all different kinds of exoplanets, and we're rapidly getting to the point where we will be able to say whether Earth-like planets are common or not, and the next generations of telescopes will be able to tell us something about whether or not there's biological activity on those planets. So we're kind of moving in that direction. That's a little slower than some who would like to imagine the aliens actually landing on the planet and stepping out and talking to us. But we're getting there, and the science is bringing us there. But that hasn't stopped people from thinking about this. I've learned that theologians have been wrestling with this question of the kind of spiritual nature and enlightenment of other life beyond Earth for centuries, and I don't know why, but they have. There's some interesting reading on this, and then in the last century, C.S. Lewis actually wrote a science fiction series where he speculated on the spiritual nature of beings on other planets in our own solar system. Of course, we haven't found such advanced life yet, but it is science fiction. But I have to think that, at least in Christian thought, nothing would be surprising to God, and there may be beings beyond Earth that have their own relationship with God, and we would certainly learn from one another, I would think and I would hope.
Great.
Hi, thank you so much. I found this fascinating. I'd like to ask specifically, you talk about deism, theism, but I'd like to ask about the God of the Bible and Christianity. Now, obviously, we're both raised here, and I assume both as Christians. Do you think you would have come to the same belief and conclusions if, say, you were raised in another country and another faith? How might that have impacted at all? Thanks.
I'll start and you can. So that's a very good and interesting question. We were discussing before we came on stage that we've actually come to our faith and our science from kind of different directions. So I was, in fact, raised in a Christian family and really understood God and the love of God in that sense before I ever even thought about science. I always loved nature, but I really didn't know what science was or what scientists did. And my love of science grew out of that, and it's always seemed to me that science, being the study of nature, is something that fits well with understanding that God loves nature. So if we're studying nature, we're doing something that would glorify God. And so it's been kind of a natural progression to me in that sense. But I think anyone from any culture, I would imagine growing up and having the chance to think about nature, to see the beauty of nature, all of us would at least share some sense, I hope, of awe and wonder. There's this wonderful psalm that says, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies declare the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, night after night they display knowledge, and yet they don't use words. And yet people all over the world can somehow glean this message, whatever it is. And I think that's true even in a scientific sense today. People from all different cultures can look at the same scientific data or look at nature and have that same sense of awe and wonder, and hopefully even come to the same scientific conclusions. The particular faith that you might come to takes a step farther. And for me, Christian faith is about moving into a personal relationship with God. And the person of Jesus Christ provides that knowledge that God loves us personally and will forgive our sins, that he's taken our sins upon us, that we have such a thing as sin that needs to be taken care of. And it's that personal reconnection with God, in a sense, that Christian faith enables. But Francis has come from kind of a different direction in his life history, so I'll let him take it from here.
Well, I appreciate the question, and I'll answer it very personally because I think that's the way you posed it. I, of course, grew up in this country, so I was certainly more aware of Christianity and Judaism than I was of many other faiths, but I didn't embrace them as my own at all. And by the time I was in college and graduate school, had pretty much walked away and even denigrated the importance of those kinds of perspectives. So when I did have this wake-up call in medical school and realized I needed to look into this, hopefully at the time thinking I could shore up the atheism and finding out that didn't work, I did have to try to figure out, if I'm going to imagine that there is such a thing as God, which of the various faiths gives me an insight into that? Or maybe I have to make my own one. I began to study world religions in a pretty superficial way, I will admit, but I did notice that they have an awful lot in common, and we should keep that in mind, and that then one finds the differences, which are also important and significant. And it was about this time that I was also coming to grips with this idea that if God is out there, and if God does care about us, God is also about holiness, and I'm not. And this weight of realization of my own imperfections began to really become in sharp focus. And how then, just as I'm beginning to appreciate that there might be a personal God, could I possibly have a connection, a way of approaching that God, given all of my imperfections? And all of a sudden, the person of Jesus Christ made sense to me. All of a sudden, I understood why this unique individual, who was God, but was also man, and who died a terrible death on the cross as a means of making up for my sins, my imperfections, gave me then permission to be flawed and still be able to be a child of the Almighty God. And that was a revelation. I carry that with me today that caused me to then move in the direction of embracing Christianity and giving my life to Jesus. That made total sense to me. Again, that's a very personal response. I think we Christians do way too much to denigrate other faiths, and I would never want to do that in any way, because the truths and the wonderful ways in which people find their path towards understanding God are numerous, but this was my path.
I think that brings us to the end. Let me close with a quote from a famous scientist. Quote, "I have found there is a wonderful harmony in the complementary truths of science and faith. The God of the Bible is also the God of the genome. God can be found in the cathedral or in the laboratory." That's Francis Collins, of course. And I hope we've done our part in the cathedral tonight. Now, I hope the dean will send us off, maybe with a prayer.
Would you join me in thanking our wonderful, wonderful guests tonight? I don't know about you, but I could have listened for hours and hours and hours longer. It seems like we only scratch the surface of so many important questions, from the wonder of science to the deep philosophical, theological issues that are raised at the same time. So I'm grateful for you all being here and for your time this evening. And because we are a house of prayer for all people, and as Dr. Collins said, we do not want to denigrate any faith that is amongst us, I'm going to build a little prayer from a quote that I love that we were talking about in the back room as we were getting ready to come out. C.S. Lewis once wrote, and I can't quote him exactly, but it's a quote that I love, and I think I have it pretty much correctly. He said, "The great yearning of my life has been to find the place where all the beauty came from." And I just love that quote as another way of talking about a yearning for God. And so may the source of all beauty, the source of all wonder, the source of all discovery and love, bless you and keep you, watch over and protect you this day and always. God bless you. Thank you for being here.